Welcome to the first panel of the day, moving past the welcome Indigenous food sovereignty. And moderating this panel is Diana Gunter.
Welcome everybody, thanks for being here. So my background is in community development work, and I feel absolutely honored to be able to be here and to moderate a panel, because I know we're working amongst giants here and game changers and people who've done decades and decades of changing the conversation so that we can all learn and understand and support work that needs to be done. I'm actually gonna hand over the introductions to the panelists, because I feel it's their place to speak for a couple of minutes what their specific expertise, background, work, and commitment and passion is. So I'm going to start off with Chanel Jenkins Thompson.
Hello. Okay, let's see how I can get this going. So I've only had about a decade of work, so not decades and decades, but I'll do my best to contribute to the conversation. So my name's Charnel. I was born in Peace River, Alberta. I am of mixed ancestry. My mother is an immigrant from Wales with Jewish farming background, and my father is from the prairies, and he is of Métis and Cree descent. And we moved to the Vancouver Island, and so I grew up in Chenemo territory for most of my life before moving to Vancouver to pursue a bachelor's of social work, and then ended up at Cedar Cottage Neighborhood House, drawn to place-based work. And from there, I've been doing work on food security, literacy, working with newcomers and refugees, and of course, working with our wonderful urban Aboriginal families.
Thank you. The next panelist is Sis Weiss, who did the opening, and is a good friend of mine, and I feel very honored that she's here to speak.
Heichka. I think actually Deanna was also just meaning collectively between us, we have decades and decades of work. Just so you don't feel so much pressure, and we don't feel dated in our age and experience. But no, it's such a great honor to be here. In a nutshell, a lot of people know me as the Indigenous plant diva, which, yes, I'm a diva, and even had my toes painted for today, and with a hibiscus flower, one of my favorite Indigenous medicines of Hawaii. I'm from the Pacific Northwest Coast. I am Squamish, Stalo, and Hawaiian descent, as well as Swiss, and my whole life has been about learning Indigenous medicines and walking the land with people, teaching. The biggest thing for me is Indigenous knowledge transfer. So I've really tried to practice that with my daughter, and now I'm looking forward to becoming a grandmother, where I get to impart knowledge on the next generation. And this year, my daughter started studying ethnobotany at SFU with one of my favorite instructors, and so it's just filling my heart with joy and love. And I run a tea house, or not a tea house, but a tea company called Raven and Hummingbird Tea Company. Gather most of my herbs. I grow stuff. I buy, sell, and trade, because I really believe in Indigenous economies and all of us supporting each other, honoring protocols such as this morning, and asking permissions for where I go and gather. I travel a lot, but when I go places, I really try to ask, can we be here to gather? If the permission's not there, I won't even go into a place and share knowledge. People have asked me, come up to my community. I'm like, well, I have to know that it's okay to be there and gather and share information, because I don't want to insult people. So there's a lot of, that's the stuff I bring to the table. That's my background in a nutshell, but I hope to share more in the panel today. And yeah, Heichka, Osiam.
Thank you. And we're also extremely happy to have the awesome Don Morrison in the house. So if you want to speak a little bit about your background.
White Kohuadip. I just greeted you in my Secwepemc language. Hello, everyone. And Sis is known as the Indigenous plant diva, and the elders in my community call me the lipstick gardener. I had an elder one time say, why do you wear lipstick to the garden? I'm like, I love lipstick. So now I'm sure to do that before I go to the garden. I am the mother of one daughter, 27-year-old daughter, and I am the daughter of Bernice August Morrison Heather, who I've inherited my Secwepemc ancestry from, and my late grandparents, Edith Sewell of the Adams Lake Indian Band, and my late grandfather, Willard August from the Nisconnet Indian Band in the heart of Secwepemcúlecw, the land of the Shuswap. And I also inherited Irish and Scottish ancestry from my father, hence the last name Morrison. And no, Jim and Van are not my cousins. So I came to my work in this lifetime, and my earliest childhood memory was about 5 years old in the garden beside my mother, who attended residential school from the time she was 5 to the age 13, and she had me when she was 15. So that tells you about her life. Her childhood was stolen from the Indian residential school, and so as a result, I grew up with the intergenerational impacts of Indian residential school, being the eldest in my family, and actually the eldest of the entire generation of both my mom's and my dad's side of the family. So my childhood was filled with a lot of the social issues that we see in the downtown east side Vancouver. I was actually on the streets in downtown Vancouver when I ran away from home at 15 years old. And so growing up with a lot of the social issues, my childhood, there's only a few good memories actually, and one of them was in the garden, and it was beside my mother, who it was often hard to remember a time when she was so at peace, but she was that day. And I remember being in the garden underneath the big tall corn plants with the silk tassels glistening in the sun, and it was just so quiet and calm, and she was happy and I was happy. And that memory lasted me a lifetime, and it inspired me. It brought me to study horticulture and ethnobotany formally in college and university. I studied restoration of natural systems at UVic, and then I went on to work in my own home community in Nisconnet to help start community gardens and support project development around revitalizing Secwepemc food culture, harvesting. And my late Wolverine, Jones Ignace, my uncle, and my auntie Flora Sampson were the first elders to welcome me back home, into my home community when I went home to heal from my own addictions and my own health issues back in the year 2000. So I just want to remember him. He just recently passed on. I am now currently, thanks to another elder who recently passed on, Kathleen Neen, the late Kathleen Neen, who many of you probably know or heard of, was one of my biggest mentors in addition to my uncle Wolverine, and she recently passed away this year too. And she was one of the biggest supporters for spearheading the working group on Indigenous food sovereignty that I am the co-founder and director of. I've been consistently holding this space for 10 years now. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year at the day leading up into the BC Food Systems Network gathering at the home of the very first Indigenous Food Sovereignty Conference that happened at the Anaukin Center, an Indigenous arts and cultural post-secondary education institution on Penticton Indian Reserve, with world-renowned Jeanette Armstrong and her team, and all the amazing women who came together 10 years ago to make this happen. And it's kind of just grown into this huge, beautiful ball of energy all of its own. And I've been consistently holding the space for the working group, but also open to receiving all the teachings that communities have shared with me. I have to always remember that our ancestors and our communities, that this is much bigger than me or any one of us. It's a beautiful, most sustainable, most beautiful expression of some of the most sustainable adaptation strategies of humanity in Indigenous hunting, fishing, farming, and gathering communities. that still persists to this day in the 21st century. So that's me in a long. I always have a hard time
much
talking
more.
about.
Thank you so much, Dawn.
Thank you.
We actually have a number of questions prepared, and I'm going to do something unusual. I'm going to throw it out all at once, because there's a feeling that we might not have enough time to answer them, at length. So I wanted the panelists to feel free to pick what's the most interesting, pertinent question and be able to speak to that. So I'm happy to repeat any of the question if anybody needs a reminder and a refresher, but yeah, we felt people wanted to have enough time to, talk us through their stories and their answers. So we had a set of questions that focused on how do we work with food through the lens of reconciliation and anti-colonialism. That was obviously the context that we're in, and it needs to be explored. People also wanted to know, how can one demonstrate allyship in this conversation? It's, it's something people are interested in, and I guess they want to understand the processes and a good way of doing that work. Of particular interest is how indigenous food systems are being currently expressed in indigenous communities in the Vancouver area and further afield, and how that interacts or can be reconciled with the agri-food system, or how it, in a way could also, not be reconciled. And again, questions around what are the different successful models where we see communities engage in traditional knowledge and food systems, and what needs to happen to support more models of success. So I'm going to hand it over to Dawn first. I can repeat any of the questions, but you're probably in a space where you want to jump in where you feel the most work needs to happen. So.
Thank you. Okay, so there is a lot in that, and as you can see from my introduction, I can tend to talk really high context, and so yeah, hopefully at least little bits of each question will be answered in some way. So I guess I'll start with talking about what I've learned about how the indigenous food system is being expressed. And I'm going to integrate some of the languaging and terminology that I've picked up through facilitating and organizing a lot of conversations. And that it's decolonizing language and terminology that I'll integrate into my describing. And first of all, I want to say one of the biggest decolonizing paradigms is to avoid the need to define everything. So I think that's important for me to put up front. I'm Secwepemc, but I don't know everything about everybody's indigenous food system, how it's being expressed in every community and every nation. There's a lot of diversity in indigenous nations in BC, what's known to the settlers as BC. There's 27 nations of indigenous peoples here, and we're all diverse. 8 of the 11 major Aboriginal language groups that exist in Canada exist here in BC. 2/3 of all the biological diversity in Canada exists in this province. So it's hugely diverse, and I don't want to, come off like I'm describing every indigenous food system and I'm the end-all be-all expert on that. So we need to avoid the need to define it, and instead I'll just describe what I've learned, and coming from my own reality that exists in my own community, and comparing that somewhat to all the communities that have hosted me around the province and around the world and across Canada. I work with Food Secure Canada and the Indigenous Circle, and I've gone and learned from other Indigenous peoples in other countries, and we know that there's a high population of Indigenous peoples from other countries around the world who live here, and live in the same kind of fourth world reality that we live in as Indigenous peoples, sovereign Indigenous peoples living within a first world country like Canada. We often live in third world conditions, so you just need to look to the downtown east side to see that. And it's often kind of shameful for Canada to think that it boasts the fourth highest quality of living in the world, according to the United Nations Human Development Index. But yet, Indigenous peoples are struggling. There's a huge disparity. There's huge gaps in the socioeconomic realities that we live in. There's also a lot of diversity and complexity in the politics, given that the governing structures and processes that have been instituted through the band council systems, it's created a political quagmire for many of our communities who want to maintain or strengthen our hereditary governing structures and processes, and those that are kind of more entrenched in the colonial government elected system that's quite divisive and allows, and it actually has established a techno-bureaucratic framework and a legal doctrine that has dispossessed Indigenous peoples through our own natural laws and our own original instructions. So that's the sovereignty, kind of the way that sovereignty is expressed in my community, and that's what my Uncle Wolverine, many of you probably have heard of the Gustafson Lake standoff, hugest land conflict in Canada. 70,000 rounds of ammunition were fired at my relatives. Not one person was shot, because I believe it's because our sovereignty, which comes directly from Creator, was protecting us, because they were there doing Sundance ceremony, and that was what protected them from being shot by the Canadian Army that was called in. So it's huge. There's been a lot of land conflicts. So I think in terms of reconciliation, we need to really look at, Canada needs to look, and Canadian citizens, we call on Canadian citizens to push their governments to call for the national inquiry on the Gustafson Lake standoff, to reconcile outstanding land claims that are really, really important for conserving our biocultural heritage, where our hunting, fishing, gathering, and farming takes place. That is where our heritage is expressed, and that is our food system. It's a lot broader in scope, ecological, cultural, and temporal scope, from the agri-food system that actually has a history of dispossession, the way it was originally introduced in the late 1800s, and led to the Civilization Act, based on a cultural hierarchy on par with British morality that rated, classified Indigenous people as savage and hunters and gatherers that were not, or were inferior to the agriculturalists, the agrarian. Yet we had the most abundant, highly localized food system, and if it weren't for the exclusive kind of way that we governed the wild salmon fisheries, the first settlers would not have had food. The history and Cease can probably vouch for, just even in the Coast Salish language, the word Cholitum translates to hungry people, but it's also what's used to identify the non-native people, the first settlers. So it tells you the history of food security and food sovereignty. I think Indigenous peoples, we've contributed a lot to the establishment of the society, yet we've been dispossessed through the techno-bureaucratic frameworks that we still struggle to deliver programs and to do all this work without that system kind of on our side. There's a lot of systemic barriers, and so there's a lot in that. Truth and reconciliation, and thinking about the ways that trying to broaden the scope of food systems conversations to include and support and help people think through, how does Canadian society support Indigenous peoples in our own efforts to do it for ourselves, to be self-determined, to be actively involved in everyday activities around growing and harvesting and sharing and preparing our food. There's some beautiful examples of that. Cease, I've been working with Cease. She is a member of our working group on Indigenous food sovereignty, has been since the very beginning. And I've learned a lot from kind of the work she does in terms of teaching people about the plants and the foods. Several projects through the what's known now as the Tuwash project. She started that, and that's been really an amazing project with recognized for best practices in the Public Health Agency of Canada, working with urban Indigenous people in the downtown east side to be in a community around food. There's so many more different projects that are happening around the province. It's actually, I'm drawing a blank right now for a lot of them because there's so many, and yeah, and that's what's inspired me to keep going and to be able to put my time and energy into organizing meetings and conferences, even though a lot of my work has been unpaid. It's, you know, there's been little bits of funding come here and there, but it certainly isn't enough to pay my bills. But that's okay, we keep doing it because that's what we do as Indigenous peoples. And I have some pretty strong leaders, models in my family who have done work way bigger with very little money from the government, or we just do it, right? That's not to say we wouldn't welcome funding, but so one of the ways as well that the Indigenous food system is being expressed, and I think it's there's many different ways we could talk about and describe it, but another really key important consideration is the paradigm. So the Indigenous food system is expressed through more of a holistic health model or a regenerative paradigm as opposed to a productionist paradigm. I've never gone into an Indigenous community, or very rare, and maybe more so recently, some of the young people are picking up the productionist language and terminology and resource-based paradigm, but for the most part, our elders and the traditional Indigenous food and culture paradigm is not productionist. Production paradigm was instituted in the Industrial Revolution, and it was a way to mathematically mechanize the food system, and it calculated out a lot of the cultural and social and spiritual values. So that's what we're dealing with in capitalism and kind of the large scale global food system that's been charted out throughout the Industrial Revolution up to now. So it's enabled, a lot of production on a pretty large scale, but it really misses a lot of the languaging and the beautiful narrative around culture and how we talk about that in a more meaningful way. So production paradigm is something that I think is a way that shifting that paradigm is a way that we can reconcile the great work that I'm seeing you all do in terms of trying to make the food system more sustainable and local. And I know that there's a lot of really good work happening within the non-Native community and especially this circle of people. And I think there's ways that that agriculture can still happen, but we just start to talk about it differently. We start to tell a different story. We take the time to build more meaningful relationships around it. The Indigenous paradigm is also very much relationship-based. So we don't call the salmon or the water a resource. We call that a relation. We have a deep, intimate connection, even on a genetic level, with those foods. So to call it a resource is actually devaluing the rich relationship, the intimate relationship that we have with our food. And it helps us to be more mindful of that even when we're eating it. So we have a lot of ancient spiritual and cultural protocols around our food that we would never treat it just as a product. And the commodification of it is a huge issue, point of contention in Indigenous communities. When we think about Indigenous food economies, like Cease had mentioned earlier, we think of some of the most sustainable economies, our giving economy still persists today. So when I did research at Kwantlen University a couple of years ago to help weave an Indigenous narrative into the thinking they were doing on the bioregional food system design, I had to say to the team of researchers that we can't value wild salmon in the same way that you're asking us to value the food system in monetary terms, because it's a giving economy, and most every community, Indigenous community I've been in, gives it, and we receive it, and we give spiritual offerings, and our economy starts with giving offerings, with giving, not taking, and it's not about money, it's about a reciprocal relationship with all that we know and all that we don't know. There's a beautiful unseen world. We know that now. Quantum physics has affirmed what Indigenous people have been talking about for ages, about energy in the world. A lot of, this is a technological example that I'm still not sure how I feel about, but the Tesla car, it confirms too that there is an unseen energy, and we know that as Indigenous peoples. We've been observing those protocols with the unseen world. That's our economy, where it starts anyways. And then in terms of trading and sharing, that economy still persists as well. So that's the other, way that the Indigenous food system is expressed through an economy that is more based on giving, sharing, and trading. And one of the ways we can reconcile that in the mainstream economy, and with the work you're doing in the growing number of cooperatives that are popping up all over the place, which is a really beautiful relationship-based kind of approach to the economy, is through developing cooperatives. But there's also a movement out of the US called the Mutual Aid Network, and they are creating robust budgeting templates for budgeting other values other than money in the economy. So right now in the economy, the only thing that gets accounted for is money. But we know that actually underneath that all, in the informal economy, there's a lot of other different kinds of transactions that happen, that exchange energy and time and services and knowledge. So the Mutual Aid Network is developing a really amazing template. I urge you to Google them. They're on the internet. And that's one way we can look at that kind of a template and start to develop different kinds of financial intermediaries that will move us away from just a more of a mixed economy that isn't just about money. So, and then it's giving us that richer narrative back, a broader context to be able to talk about the food economy. So those are really good, innovative ways to cross-fertilize the work that you're doing with the Indigenous food system. And I think it would be good to end a little bit on decolonizing and I think when I talk about decolonizing, I talk about it in terms of research and relationships, because working together, and I get a huge amount of non-Indigenous peoples who email me about advice on research. And yes, as the working group on Indigenous food sovereignty, we have been leading conversations around how do we lead to generating a body of knowledge and research institutions that will support Indigenous food sovereignty, recognizing that the techno-bureaucratic framework and the agri-food system framework, the knowledge system and the outreach and extension system, you won't find Indigenous literature or research anywhere in that. We've been totally made invisible. So in order to position us in research, we need to decolonize thinking about how that research is done, because the Western scientific paradigm is very reductionist, and it doesn't allow for the complexity that we as Indigenous peoples know that we're all connected. Hochwaida is how we say in my language, all my relations, and it means just that we're all connected, and our worldview comes at research and ways of knowing from that way, which is totally opposite from the reductionist that Western science reduces everything to simplest terms. And while there's a role for that, it's not the only way, and we need to start to change the institutional thinking around that. I know it's pretty revolutionary, and I'm just, sometimes I think I'm crazy for repeating it because I'm like, what does that really mean, right? But I think it requires people really just asking themselves those bigger systems questions, but also in actually supporting Indigenous people, we're overwhelmed. We're burdened to respond to the huge response, and it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful struggle, but it's challenging, and if we're doing that in a relationships-based approach, then that means we need to be a little bit more, I guess, just mindful of what does that relationship really look like in terms of power, in terms of privilege, in terms of peace, and actually being able to do this work in a peaceful way, like and really being in the present with it, recognizing that we're running around like we're all kind of whipped a little bit in this productionist paradigm and this mechanical clock that kind of dominates the world that we live in. So those are a lot of biggies, I know. But
Thank you so much, Dawn. This has been so encompassing, so in depth. It's really great that you can speak to it from a micro and macro level.
Okay. All my relations.
Thank you. We're going to pass on to Cece now, and I think there's specific interest to hear what is happening and what work she has been doing locally. So if you wanted to speak to that or any of the other questions, you're more than welcome.
Sure. I was actually going to say have her go next, but we can. Or do you want to go next? Or yeah, okay. Can you go over the questions again, just so I? Because now I'm like swimming in that pool of knowledge that is Dawn Morrison, and you know.
So one of the questions was, what are some different models where we see communities successfully re-engage in their traditional knowledge and food system, and what needs to happen to support more models of success? And a similar question is, describe how the Indigenous food system is being expressed in Indigenous communities in the Vancouver area. And the other two questions relate to how is working with food, how is it about reconciliation or decolonization, and how can allyship from other communities and immigrants be brought into that conversation?
Kaichka. Yeah, just going to see if I can do this. I may pull it right off of there if I feel like it. So yeah, I'm used to longhouse voice, so then I'm all of a sudden talking in a machine, but I think it's important because it's being recorded, and I believe in that. I believe in old technology, which is Indigenous food and plant systems, and I also equally believe in the modern technology, because without the old technology, we wouldn't have this new technology. It's something I really try to impart that knowledge on a lot of youth that I work with. So looking at models of Indigenous food systems and food security projects that exist, I look at what one of the main projects both Dawn and I have worked on over the years through the UBC, what was originally the Urban Aboriginal Community Kitchen Project became the Tawush Project. Before that started, I was consulted on that project with Kamala Todd and a number of people that she and I were the only First Nations at the table, but other people across the board that saw a need to fill that gap. And we began that important work, so that's, been over 15 years of watching that develop into what it is now, and it took many years and many knowledge carriers like Dawn and I who really put our time in and discussing with organizations like the Vancouver Native Health Society. I was originally offered a job with that, and I said, well, to work in this job, I have to be honest, I'd sustain myself better on welfare at the wage that you have. So I really called them to task on the fact that you can't put anybody, especially an Indigenous person, into a job that's focused on food security without making sure that they're food secure themselves, and that they have a living wage, And that was back when rents were like a third of what they are today, right? So they've really jumped up, and it's gone from a barely livable city to very, very barely livable city here. And so over the years, myself, Dawn, the two of us have really put a lot of our efforts into creating a space and a position that gives whoever works there a living wage and some, culturally dignified access to, basically the same thing as food security. Like you can't just have dignified access to culturally appropriate food. You have to have the same thing in living arrangements. So that, over the years I was developing that, I also began talking to people in my community who wanted to see something come about for our people, because the Squamish people are often misread as being one of the wealthiest nations in the province, and we're here in an urban environment, yet there is extreme poverty in our community. And I myself experienced it over the last few years, where I became homeless and had to live invisibly homeless in this city, and so it's a reality. And thank goodness that I've been a youth worker and a food security rep for years, because how would I have survived without having connections? And from being here, I could actually live on the land in the city without, and still find jobs to get by, and very minimal jobs at most times. But I'm just one of thousands that are dealing with that. Thankfully now really well housed in a very affordable place in the East Side, but having said that, it was a struggle, and it made me really, I feel that happened for a reason, that I had to really, be there in that position to understand how much harder it is for individuals that are living completely homeless, completely without food, completely without any access to what they need to get by. And thankfully it happened after my daughter moved out on her own. Because I've been a single parent, I've been passionate about doing these jobs and doing this work, because I saw a need for my daughter to grow up in a cultural way, although we're in an urban environment. And that's the dream and reality for most urban Indigenous people and most rural Indigenous people. We all want to have that access. So Squamish Nation has given us little bits of support, but actually not a whole lot of financial support in our food security projects that we've done. And so these elders asked me, would I help them develop a community kitchen and garden project, which then developed into a wetlands restoration project as well. So it's 3 stages. And over the last 8 years, and while I was working with the Urban Aboriginal Community Kitchen Garden Project, which became Tawusht, I was able to actually I was working 2 jobs, one for free and one just kind of helping me pay my rent. And in both cases, I was seeing like the level of poverty that truly exists in the urban Indigenous community in Vancouver, as well as in the North Shore. And so we weren't just seeing people in our community, we were seeing people from many walks of life that started coming into our community kitchen. And these elders just, when they said, let's start a soup kitchen, I said, no, soup kitchens start the wheel of apathy rolling. So, in my own way, I was trying to help them decolonize that system of food management. And in our communities, Indigenous communities, when we have feasts, that's often what our community kitchen is, to be honest, right? Like people watch for feasts because they don't get good food. But when they go to a feast, wow, they can eat, and they often stock up and bring things home to feed their families. And that's what a community kitchen is. So how do we do this in a cultural way that helps? And luckily, even though there's this fine line between love and hate with the church, they're the only ones that offered a kitchen to us. So we used St. Paul's church basement, not accessible for people in wheelchairs and people that have trouble with stairs, but it created a space for us to cook food. And what we were finding in the beginning was 1 or 2 people would stream in and show up with little containers and fill up the food. And this, like literally for the first 6 months, people were doing this, and we were trying to troubleshoot without using styrofoam and other things. We couldn't afford to always buy, like the little Tupperware type containers and stuff, but we're always looking for ways that, okay, people are too shy to come in. Through that work, we discovered shut-ins throughout our community. So this community that's viewed as extremely rich and wealthy by the rest of the nation, the rest of the world, because we live in the most expensive property in the North Shore, and we're on the waterfront, so therefore we should have money. But in fact, there were people that had not left their houses in years, and people were just bringing them food. And so when they found out about the kitchen, they were like, all right, because now I'm not spending my welfare check that diminishes in a week on that. I can go to this kitchen every week and bring food to these people. And then eventually, after a couple of years, those shut-ins started coming into the community kitchen. About 5 years into our programming and we built the garden within the first year or two. So 5 years into that, one day this woman shows up in the garden and plants a whole plot, and she's so excited, and this was really revolutionary for her. And we never saw her again, but she was there for that day. And during that time, she spoke about how she basically told us a story of being a shut-in, and that she'd been a shut-in for years, and that one of the women from the garden, or from the kitchen program, had brought her into the kitchen eventually. So she went from having her food brought to her to coming to the kitchen, to coming to the garden and planting. We saw that as a success story. So this is a reality. I tell you this story because it's a reality across the country. When we hear stories about Attawapiskat going without water, living in super impoverished community conditions next to a diamond mine, this is what's going on. Then looking at Squamish Nation and seeing, there's resource extraction going on all around us. And it's only now that people are being asked in our nation to step up and be at the table. So then we're, there's half of our nation that is, let's sell the resources, and half of us that's saying, don't do it. So there's a lot of, all this decolonization stuff needs to happen within our communities, and it's not. It's just not. It's a harsh time for us all, and then we see this extreme poverty going on. So there's a lot of cases where these things are working, not working, but we invited Nancy J. Turner to our garden. Anybody that doesn't know her, she's a well-known ethnobotanist who has studied probably all of our people's indigenous plants for years, gleaning knowledge off of elders, writing books, and a lot of people that study ethnobotany read her books. She came to our garden a couple of years ago, and she said, this is exactly what everybody should be doing. We have an ethnobotanical section to our garden with a didactic panel that shows English, Squamish, and Latin names of plants, a little blurb about each. We have a food garden. We have bees, not just honeybees, but all kinds of, we work on all kinds of habitat strategies for wild bees. And we have a pond with indigenous wapato, which is wild potato, and we're trying to grow camas. So we're actually putting in food that hasn't grown in our nation's lands and waters for over 100 years because of urbanization. And we're the only ones in our community doing that. And so the only other place in the Lower Mainland that's focusing on Wapato is the Katzie Nation, which is where I first learned about Wapato. And through their legends and stories, when my mom did land claims research. So all this, it takes us decades to learn. Like, why have we been doing this for decades? Because it takes decades to learn the things that have been taken away from us and the things we're trying to bring back to our people. Decolonization, it's as much as there were little girls terrorizing our garden for 2 years and leaving notes saying, don't stop me from destroying the garden. And I started actually just on my own going around the community asking people, little kids, why is this happening? And they're like, oh, well, our mothers encourage us. And I'm like, okay, so what is decolonization? It needs to happen in our communities first. We're working all the time with non-Native people to discuss this, but it's, that's the easy work, to be honest, that we're doing, because people are, now willing to talk to us in our 125th year in BC, But in our communities, the damage is so intrinsic, we have to gently deal with that. And so I had a success story at spring break where the two little girls that were the worst culprits showed up in the garden, and they literally dropped their jaws when they saw there were people in the garden, and then they pretended to just want to walk through the garden. I'm like, come on in, and hey, let's walk around the garden. And I knew what their game was, but I'm not going to call them out on it because I don't want to scare them away. I want to make them fall in love with the garden, because then they're going to go back and tell their mothers. And that's exactly what happened. So that took 2 years and a lot of heartbreak, where they were destroying the Wapato pond because they didn't know what it was. They didn't understand it was our oldest food. So our people have been through the residential school, through what the Indian Act continues to do to, be an intrinsic part of our laws in Canada. And I invite any of you to go online and read any part of the Indian Act to see why we talk about decolonization. It is a very racist, sexist document, and it governs our people across the board. It still exists today. I didn't know until I started reading it that I grew up actually breaking the law. I was not really supposed to go into my community because I was a non-status Indian. And through the work of my mother and my aunts, one of my aunties is Sharon McIver, who you might have heard of the McIver Law. My mother did all the research and paralegal work to create that law. And my daughter just found out a few years ago that these 3 women that have raised her basically have been changing history for women, or herstory for the women in this country, Indigenous peoples, and bringing people back to their communities. So it was one time a fact that non-status Indians could not go into their communities if they weren't status. So I was breaking the law every time I went to visit my grandparents. Those are the realities. Why do we have to decolonize? Why do we need a reset button? Why is this important? Because it's not just important for us to talk to non-Indigenous people. It's about Indigenous people being able to work with each other, talk to each other, and be on the same level. Like, it was a big star day when this little girl, who is my cousin, her mother messaged me to say, Mabel really loves coming to the garden. I'm really surprised. I'm like, I'm really happy she's there. After 2 years of, I'm going to destroy the garden, signed Mabel. It's like, please, I was crying like tears, of pain for a couple of years there, just trying to stop that. And like, I was angry at times. I won't even lie. And I would see her and know what she was doing, and I had to really suppress my true feelings and not scream, but I had to overcome that and put my hands out, extend my hands, and help her to understand the importance. Now the notes she leaves are, the bees are dying, we have to save them. I'm like, yes, so, that is one hurdle that I've gotten over, and that gives me more hope than anything across the board. Because if we can get through to one individual, she now brings four friends with her to the garden, and they do things. They water, they look at things to plant, they're excited. So, that is a new beginning for me, and that is like one thing off my bucket list. Get the youngest people in our nation on board. They are the drops of water in the puddles of their home that create those ripple effects, become big in their communities, in their families, in our whole community. So there's a lot more I could talk about, but I think those are the important things for me right now, is sharing how we need to get our whole community on board. And I'm always bringing in Native and non-Native people from outside of our community to help show the people in my community how exciting it is to raise bees, to make mason bee environments and other wild bee environments, to plant mushrooms, to fix the air and fix the earth, and so on and so forth. So Everything we all do makes a difference. That's what I know. And, understanding that simple philosophy about assuming, if you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. And that is a really big thing that I have to sometimes tell myself. I can't assume that people in my community want to eat traditional foods because they don't know what they are. And I've spent the whole winter and spring teaching an elder what sunchokes are, and she hated them until recently. And just having gentle conversations with her to help decolonize her food relationships. And, we're all responsible. That's what I think. We can't, I used to hear conversations from non-native people, well, I can speak your language, and it's like, great, good for you. I can't. Don't rub it in my face. Don't make me angry, Instead, tell me how I can engage in a conversation once I start learning my language from my elders. And then, quit putting this us and them thing. Eye contact. That's where it starts. And staying on that level. Hachka.
Thank you so much, Cease. That was gut-wrenching and heartfelt and so important. Thank you for sharing. We're going to move on to Chanel. Do you want me to repeat a question, or you want to tell us about your work and where you hope to have impact?
Sure. No, I think I'll start. So I think I'll start by just saying, for myself, food is how I began to decolonize myself, and that is a process that only began a few years ago, because for so long food was just survival, up until my early 20s, which I'm still in. And food was that way of needing to bring medicine to myself for my mental well-being, as I watched generations of poor mental health through my father's family and also my mother's family. And it took a long time to make that disconnection between our food system and our family, to understand that this was a way that I could choose to bring myself through this process of decolonization. It's still an ongoing process. It's still hard to shift that mindset from survival to food is celebration, food is joy, food is coming together. It's still, going to the grocery store and having to do that mind check of how much money do I have, how can I get through that? And that's what I see at my work. We're in this place of so many of us who are urban Aboriginals in Vancouver struggling to survive in this city that has become very unwelcoming to us because of high rents and unaffordability. That how can we use food to celebrate when we're often so forced to stand in lines, we're often forced to choose between food. So often my mother would often go without eating so that my sister and I could eat. So that's where in my work that I wanted to learn how to do that, how to bring back in those moments and create that space where food could be decolonization and food could be celebration and relationship, just for those moments at the neighborhood house. Because I knew for lots of the times during those weekends, families are coming in, they're unable to get the food bank, cut the line short, they couldn't get through the door. Now they don't know what to do. They don't have the milk for their children. So that's been part of my work and my process, which I'm still very much in, is to create that space and looking to the work of Cease coming in and talking about planting and creating that excitement at the neighborhood house. Because so many of the families, like myself, are mixed. We don't have access to our lands. We don't live in our territories because there was no, didn't seem like a future there for our parents. So they made that choice to come into the cities to see where the opportunities were. And so it's, I just keep going back to that. It's such a process of finding those moments, because it's not an everyday thing that you get to live and embody. It's often trying to find those moments where you can take time to eat with purpose, take time to eat together and share and pass the food and help the elder, plate the elder their food, help another mom with their infant. and to just pause and find those. And going back to, what Cisa's talking about with the kids, it's the kids where we see that we have that opportunity where that maybe they'll start their process with food and decolonization much younger, where they get to have that excitement, where they get to watch their squash grow, where they get to learn what the calendula flowers are, where they get to eat the herbs straight from the garden. You know, we've had children become really excited because they've been able to nurture, they've been able to find that in themselves through nurturing plants. And often these are kids who, often because they're fed food that is so poor for their health that they're not able to succeed in classrooms because they're in classrooms where they're hungry and they're acting out. They're fed food that is of poor quality because they're just trying to make it through so that they're full, that they get to have moments with planting, whether with the earth, they're touching the earth, that they feel that they are a nurturer, that they are a warrior in terms of that they are caring, and they are caring for life. And often the time they're the kids that are the problems in the classroom. So I think that's been a really exciting process, and is much where we can look to our allies in the food community to see that the children need to be in the dirt, they need to be touching, they need to be growing, they need to be nurturing, and learning and carrying that knowledge forward, that not only that how to plant a seed, but what do you do when your seed doesn't grow, and become part of that life cycle and learn that process. Because that's often what I try to make space for. And I guess, and that's also just, in this room of people that are looking, okay, what can we do for Indigenous food sovereignty? How can we be part of that? It's often that acknowledgement of just that creation of space that, kids in our community need that space to feel safe, to trust, to grow. For myself growing up, I did not trust. I did not want to engage with folks, because so much of not having food and having poor food is to hide and to try and make that not visible because you want to fit in. So making that space and recognizing that we are all in process of decolonizing. I don't think you'll come across a single person that is like, yes, I've done it, I've decolonized, it's happened. That we are in process constantly. And we as ourselves, as urban Aboriginal people, are struggling with the realities of food insecurity, are struggling with making a livelihood in this work, because we all know there's not the money to do that. And just to walk and with us in that, and that, yes, we are happy to support your engagement in decolonization, but recognizing the space we need to do it ourselves, first and foremost. And I think I'll just end there. I don't need to keep going.
So good.
Oh my God, thank you so much. All the panelists, so outstanding, so comprehensive.